Welcome, everyone. My name is Keith Martin. I'm the Executive Director of the Consortium of Universities for Global Health here in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for joining our webinar today. The purpose of this webinar is to share with you some very significant budget cuts that are now in front of Congress and what we can do together to be able to ensure that the investments that have taken place into key U.S. government agencies supporting global health across parties for many years continue, and we can continue to grow and strengthen the great work that our public servants are doing in the U.S. government in these vital areas. Today we're joined by two experts in the area, and I want to thank them because this webinar is done in conjunction with both of their organizations. The first is Mr. Tony Mazzaschi, who is the Director of Policy for the Association of Schools and Programs in Public Health, and Dr. Stephen Morrison, who is the Vice President for the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So Tony and Steve, thank you very much for joining us today. For everybody on the webinar, the first 30 minutes will be presentations by both Tony and Steve, and then we will leave 30 minutes for Q&A from you. So get your questions ready. Tony, thanks very much for joining us. Please, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Since the beginning of the year, it has appeared as though public health has been under attack in the federal policymaking area, and it is nowhere more apparent than in the global health area. As we all know, toward the end of May, the president issued his budget proposal. He proposed major cuts in all areas of the federal government except for Veterans Affairs, Homeland Security, and the Department of Defense. The largest cuts were reserved for the State Department and Environmental Protection Agency, but even in the areas of the Department of Health and Human Services, he's proposed massive cuts that will be under consideration by Congress in the next few months. Part of the cuts were intended to help fund a major increase in the Department of Defense, transferring $54 billion from the domestic discretionary side, which is where most of our programs reside, and putting them into the defense area. It's important to understand that these cuts come on top of other effective cuts affecting federal agencies. It's not like these agencies have been on the gravy train for the last 7 years. And this graphic from the Washington Post, I think, best explains how these cuts would be on top of earlier cuts, which for example, for the State Department and international programs, would amount to more than a 50% cut over the last 7 or 8 years. So we mainly focus at ASPPH on the Labor HHS Education Appropriations Bill, which funds the public health service agencies, and the president proposed massive cuts in programs of interest to us in that particular bill. For example, a 21% cut at NIH, an effective 21% cut at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and HRSA would suffer a 4.4% cut. Within that budget proposal, though, it is a complete wipeout of many programs of interest to academic public health, such as the Prevention Research Centers, Academic Centers for Preparedness, some of the NIOSH programs. In fact, within NIOSH, all academic programs were wiped out. Two major policy proposals were embedded in the public health service accounts that are of interest, and of course one is the elimination of the Fogarty International Center, NIH's smallest institute with a budget of only about $70 million. But the budget also proposed moving the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality into NIH as a new institute. And while it may not be readily apparent, those two proposals are actually linked. When NIH was last reauthorized in 2007, a provision was put in the appropriations, in the authorization statutes governing NIH, limiting the total number of NIH institutes and centers to 27. And NIH is currently at the maximum total of institutes and centers when the Center for Minority Health was increased, was given status. So if, in fact, they were going to move ARC into NIH, they needed to remove one institute or else change the underlying authorization statute. And many people think that's where the proposal came for eliminating the Fogarty International Center as the smallest institute and one with limited support, limited apparent support. That's where the proposal may have come from. It's important to recognize that Fogarty is 0.2% of the NIH budget. It is a minor, it's decimal dust in the larger context of the NIH budget. The budget narrative that the administration put out cited some of the work that NIAID does in international arena and tried to make the case that Fogarty is duplicative and unnecessary. That has not resonated very much on Capitol Hill. The budget narrative issued by the Department of Health and Human Services says that the Fogarty budget will be eliminated, but that the budget would retain $25 million for international research and research-related activities, but locate that money within the NIH Office of the Director. One other major cut that you should be aware of in the President's proposal is an effort to cap the indirect cost recovery on NIH awards to 10%. Currently, about 27% of the extramural budget of NIH goes to pay for indirect costs at educational institutions. Removing the current negotiated indirect cost system and replacing it with a 10% cap has the potential of making it impossible for many schools of public health to perform federally sponsored research, especially NIH federally sponsored research. The indirect costs just do not pay the actual costs of research if they were capped at 10%. And so for those institutions that don't have additional revenue streams, it's going to be impossible for them to be research performers. So we're strongly opposing the indirect cost cap proposal as well. And this is just one area of under recovery on federal awards. There's already been a huge amount of cost shifting to universities. Some of them are listed here from a report that our colleagues at AAMC put out. But as the salary cap and other cost shifting has become ubiquitous under federal budget pressures. The CDC budget was proposed for major cuts, as you can see from this chart from CDC. Some of the cuts include global health. They're proposing an 18% cut in global health support in the CDC budget. Some of the specific program eliminations include almost anything that has an academic connotation, including the Centers for Preparedness, Education and Research Centers, and Injury Control Research Centers, the Prevention Research Centers, major issues. And of course, none of this it relates to climate change, but climate change also, anything with climate change in it has also been whacked by the administration. And of course, the Department of State cuts are huge. 29% cut in the Department of State budget, but within global health, the cuts are about 25%, both at state and USAID. The budget narrative talks about where those cuts would be. Some of them are to the Global Fund for fighting AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, a total of $222 million in cuts. The budget also would shift money away from the Ebola emergency funds to support malaria programs. Of course, they're proposing total elimination of any international family planning program funds, huge reductions. The budget's also reducing funding for polio, and again claiming that in the budget rhetoric that other countries are not spending their fair share on these global health security issues. So let's talk a little bit about where the budget process stands. Normally, this is what we consider regular order, is the normal appropriations process. And I have to say, for the last decade or two, there has been no regular order. We've seen very rarely a budget bill passed on time. Normally, the president would propose a budget the first week of February. Given that the president wasn't inaugurated until the end of January, in a presidential year, especially a change year, that always passes by. But we have also not seen a congressional budget resolution, which by statute needs to be passed by April 15th. That's critically important because that top line number is then split up to the 12 Appropriations Committee and becomes their budget targets. None of that has happened this year. This year, of course, we had the inauguration. We had the 2017 budget resolution passed in March, and that was the legislation that contained the proposal to repeal the Affordable Care Act. We had a skinny budget released in March, which was just some brief excerpts from the larger budget that was released in May. Congress didn't clear the 2017 appropriations bill until May 4th. It still has not scheduled consideration of a 2018 budget resolution. And the president's budget on May 23rd, frankly, by Congress was immediately dismissed. And even worse, it was ridiculed because it was riddled with errors, trillion-dollar errors regarding the funding of Social Security, for example, as well as related to the tax bill. It counted benefits of the tax bill by increased tax revenues for economic activity, but it didn't reduce the budget proposal by the actual money that would have been foregone by the tax bill. And lastly, we need to keep our eye not only on the start of the fiscal year in FY 2018, which will be October 1st, but also the needed debt limit extension. The current debt limit has been reached. The Department of Treasury is doing some extraordinary things to keep the debt market afloat, but the Treasury Department says that Congress needs to pass a debt limit extension, possibly even as soon as August, but that will get mixed up in the appropriations politics. And the reason we haven't seen a budget resolution yet for 2018 is that the Senate parliamentarian has ruled that you can only have one budget resolution in play at any time. And of course, the 2017 budget resolution is being used as a method for advancing the ACA repeal. Budget resolutions allow the use of reconciliation procedures on the Senate floor that obviate the ability of the minority or others to filibuster major legislation related to funding and taxing issues. And so if you had another resolution on place, the ability of the GOP to advance ACA repeal legislation would be limited. Everyone thinks that we are headed toward a full year continuing resolution. The appropriators have been given the green light to start marking up bills based on last year's funding levels because there is no budget resolution. The plan now in the House is to merge all 12 regular appropriations bills together into an omnibus and consider them as one package and one vote on the House floor before the August recess. Whether that is going to be possible, we will see. The Senate is holding hearings but is waiting for the House to act. If a continuing resolution is passed or an omnibus, it's likely to mirror very much last year's bill with what are called anomalies. Anomalies are changes in the bill based on legislative needs, either some unforeseen change in budget totals are needed to reflect legislative changes that have happened since last year's bill, and also political whims of Congress and the administration. So it is possible that you could have a continuing resolution that either adds or removes money from accounts of which we have a great deal of interest. That happened with the continuing resolution passed in May. There was $2 billion added to boost NIH funding. It's been very difficult to try to educate the administration on the impact of these proposed cuts. And the reason is that there are not people in many of the government positions where you would normally try to have meetings so that you could educate them on the wisdom or lack thereof of some of these proposals. Well, President Trump has repeatedly tweeted about the Democrats holding up nominations. That really is not the problem. The problem is that the administration has not named people to key positions. There have been about 500 positions that are considered critical for running the government, and the Washington Post published this chart showing, this was just from last week, that 442 of the key positions have not been named. We don't have nominees for CDC, for example. We just got an announcement about 2 weeks ago about NIH and NCI. We don't have permanent leadership at many positions at HHS and at the Department of State. One of the things that we're most concerned about, given that everything is under attack in our world, is that we manage relationships between advocacy groups, because we don't want sort of a civil war to break out within our own community. So while we're advocating and educating for our priorities on the NIH, CDC, and Department of State fronts and in their bills, we are not, we're trying to make the case for these programs that we support and not trying to promote that the money be taken away from other priorities. Right now, it's a very tenuous time in the advocacy community because, as I said earlier, almost all of our programs appear to be on fire. So I will end there and welcome comments from Dr. Morrison and Dr. Martin on the current state of the appropriations fight.
Great, that was wonderful. Thank you very much, Tony. Much appreciated for your excellent presentation. And now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Stephen Morrison, the Vice President for the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Excellent job, Tony. Thanks for putting those comprehensive slides together. And thanks to Keith and Karen Lamb and other staff at CUGH for pulling us all together. I'm going to run through 6 or 8 minutes of quick comments that are complementary to Tony's presentation. Getting back to the big picture, what we have is a budget that was prepared by Mulvaney, one of the original, the head of OMB, one of the original Freedom Caucus members, in close concert with Stephen Bannon and others within the White House. It is very much a populist vision. It's an America first. It's a rather extreme, rigid vision of what the budget should look like. It's shifting resources out of development assistance into economic support funds. It's diverting resources towards ISIS and counterterrorism. It is singling out USAID and the State Department as being really enemies of a America First agenda as they have defined this. So, and as Tony indicated, the vision is to shift $54 billion out of discretionary non-defense programs into defense, and those discretionary programs are only 27% of the budget, of the U.S. budget. So it's taking an enormous bite out of this. Now, for people in global health, this is quite a departure because we've had roughly 25 years of some form of steady growth, the highest growth in the naught decade, but 4 to 5% growth in the 90s, 11 to 15% annual growth in the naught decade, a couple of percent growth in recent years, and now we're looking at the prospect of a pretty radical regression coming forward. And this is against a backdrop of a couple of things that you need to keep in mind. One is global health has been an oasis for bipartisan cooperation in Congress and between the executive and Congress for 15 years now, this expansionary period. Second point is this radical populist vision is not necessarily embraced or shared internally by many of the key leadership ranks within the administration itself. It remains to be seen exactly how disciplined and committed they are to this. We know that Secretary Mattis, Secretary Kelly, Tillerson himself at the Department of State, he hasn't been very effective at being able to defend against this. And many of the key Republican leaders and Democratic leaders in Congress. So this budget set the frame. It's the opening salvo. It is not the final word, but it's a very important in laying down some of the parameters. A few words about State Department and AID. As I mentioned, it's calling for getting out of the traditional development assistance and moving into politically nimble money, which is called economic support funds. That's coming under a lot of criticism. It's calling for mothballing 9 missions at AID and stripping out 37 missions at AID of assistance. So a dramatic scale back. Some of the key programs, family planning is proposed to be eliminated. The Policy Bureau at State Department, 45% cuts there. HIV monies shifted out of AID into state. As I said, 9 missions closed, 37 missions stripped of any assistance. Food security, almost 70% cuts. And in the bigger picture, the whole entire future of AID is really on the block right now. If you make these changes, you question what's the value and how does it operate? Does it get folded into state? Does it get dismembered? Is it kept in some rump form, et cetera? So that question is totally out on the table. In terms of State Department, the migrant ban that's still locked in court drew a very strong response among career Foreign Service officers. 1,200 signed the dissent channel objecting to this. That became public. The hostility towards the department coming out of the White House has been very thick. There's been several actions taken to gut key parts of the program. The morale is terrible. There is no incoming class arriving in July to join the foreign, so there's 4 incoming per year typically. They've canceled the July one, and there's a secretary, deputy secretary. There's a secretary's inner circle. No undersecretaries nominated. Of those 6 positions, none of the 22 assistant secretaries have been nominated. 46 ambassador positions are vacant at the moment. So we're operating with a highly demoralized and belittled foreign service and a state structure that's been mothballed for the moment. There's a process of internal reform under review, that could carry into 2018 before some of these staffing decisions are going to be made. Climate change, obviously, at state OES, $1 billion cut out of that program. There are some things, principles at work here, which are actually worthy principles, trying to bring about reform that can consolidate certain functions. Food for Peace, they're moving the PL 480 Food for Peace program into the International Development Assistance. That's actually a good proposal. Gavi is getting the Vaccine Alliance getting a step up. So where does this leave us? To the audience that's here this morning, a couple of takeaways. One is that your voice really does matter in this period. It matters in what you communicate to the leadership of your own institutions in trying to get them to step forward and be loud on this. And your voice matters in communicating to elected members of Congress. Those that are within your own state or constituency, legislative House constituency, or Senate seats in the state in which you reside, but also directing yourself to those that are in the key appropriating committees, Republicans and Democrats. Don't expect this process to have clarity anytime soon. Don't expect that your interventions are going to deliver immediate results. You have to think of this as an unprecedented period of turbulence, unpredictability, confusion, and simply work with that. And don't object in making the arguments. I think it's wrong to simply say we cannot affect any changes. We are in a period where there are going to be changes. There's going to be reforms. We need to be pressing for smart reform. We need to admit that there are going to be some changes, and we want those to be managed credibly and sensibly and strategically, and not be ad hoc and brutalist sort of reforms. Health security is one lens or motif that seems to be accepted as a reference point within this administration. I think also you need to understand that this is Tony made the point that it's been very slow to populate this administration at senior ranks. There are, however, important people that are beginning to settle in, and these are credible people. They're people that we know. They're people that care about these, the areas that they're working, whether it's Mark Green going to AID, Bill Seiger as Chief of Staff at AID, Tim Ziemer at the White House heading up the Health Security Department. There's several others. We need to be open dialogue with these folks, supportive of them in the work that they do, as well as the cabinet officers that are taking strong positions in favor of foreign aid. Mattis and McMaster in particular. I think it's also helpful to make the case that a radical regression will have huge human consequences. The Kaiser Family Foundation just did some modeling that was published last week by Jen Cates and her colleagues. Very useful modeling at showing what the implications would be of these cuts in terms of fatality rates, incidents, reignition of epidemics, and the like. I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve. Really, it was a fabulous presentation. You both have done an incredible job. The first question I'd like to ask you that's come in is, the argument's been put forth strongly by the Defense Department that investing in global health is important. Can you share with us, with the viewers, what arguments could they put forward to their congressional leaders, and in fact, Steve mentioned the leaders within their own institutions, as to what could possibly convince perhaps GOP members to invest in global health? What are the arguments that they can do that are supportive for global health, that would benefit the country, and also outlining the cost of not investing in these areas? And I'll ask either of you to comment on that.
Well, I might start. I might start and just say what we're trying to do is we're stressing the important work that that these agencies do, especially in training the next generation of professionals that benefit both our global partners, but also benefit the United States. So we are trying to make the case that while many of these have a outward-looking dimension, that they do benefit the United States and its citizens as well. We're trying to pair up both data on the return on the federal investment along with narrative stories, because that tends to really sell better on Capitol Hill. And just building on what Dr. Morrison said, I think it's important that as dismal as most of this news is, there is nothing inevitable about this change and the direction it takes. That's one of the lessons that came out of the battles on the Hill on the Affordable Care Act. Right after the election, it looked as though there was little hope that the Affordable Care Act will survive, but through hard work, we were able to affect change and stop that momentum. So I think, you know, there's no reason to lose hope here that with hard work, we can affect the change that we want to see and stop some of the more draconian and thoughtless proposals.
Thank you, Tony. A question's come up from Doug, and he's asking what Dr. Francis Collins, who's the head of NIH, what are you hearing from Dr. Collins with respect to the Fogarty budget in particular and its potential elimination?
I don't know that, I mean, there have been some meetings. Francis Collins, by the way, it was just announced recently that the White House had taken the decision to invite him to stay on as head of NIH. Prior to that point, he was an interim, he had agreed to be an interim acting head, carryover from the Obama administration, so that's not a very comfortable position to be in when asked to bring about these changes in reorganization and consolidation. And it's very powerful when an organization like Fogarty gets singled out for elimination, because it carries the logic of a kind of ritual sacrifice as part of a broader phenomenon. So unearthing that is difficult. Now, Francis Collins has been very committed in his tenure in the Obama era, very committed to global health, and has met with board members from Fogarty. I happen to be a board member of Fogarty. They've met with the board members. He's been in communication with deans and others, and has not been able to make a solid commitment to preserve the functionality. I'm not sure that's in his power, and I think it's very unclear what the outcome will be. There has been a very significant mobilization. Keep in mind, Fogarty's budget is last year $69 million. It's the smallest of the institutes. It has the least in terms of active advocates and champions in Congress, although Congressman Cole has been from Oklahoma, Republican appropriator, has been very vocal in his support, which is a great thing. And I wouldn't give up hope, but I think that Fogarty is very vulnerable and remains vulnerable. And to those in the audience here, if I could make just a personal appeal, to build Fogarty into every communication that you make, if you would.
Thank you very much. Go ahead, Tony.
Yeah, I was just going to say, last month there was a hearing before the House Labor HHS Education Appropriations Subcommittee, and in kindness really to Dr. Collins and the other NIH leaders, they scheduled it the day before the budget was released so that Director Collins did not have to carry the administration's water. He was asked about the Fogarty Institute. He refused to publicly praise the elimination. He turned the question over to Dr. Anthony Fauci, the director of NIAID, and Dr. Fauci was unambiguous in opposition to the proposal to eliminate the Fogarty. We're likely to get more out of Dr. Collins on Thursday when the Senate Labor HHS Appropriations Subcommittee meets on the budget. Dr. Fauci will also be present. I don't expect that Dr. Collins will publicly support the proposal. He's been careful in his language about his official duty to pass along the budget, but has not publicly endorsed the budget proposal. I will also say that the deans of the schools of public health and the program directors today are delivering a sign-on letter to the committee members strongly opposing the Fogarty proposal, and it's been signed, personally signed by almost all of the deans and program directors.
Thank you very much, Tony and Steve, for that. One of the questions that have come up, of course, is the global health security agenda, and something that the United States led, vital to protecting the world from pandemics. Can you share with us what kind of traction these cuts will have on the global health security agenda and preventing pandemics? Is there any traction that people are seeing in Congress in pursuing that argument to investing in global health?
I think that there's reason to be optimistic, even though the budget picture contradicts what senior people in the administration are saying on this. What I mean by that is Secretary Price's first trip outside the United States was in mid-May to Liberia, and he was there and he praised the Liberian government, the head of state, the U.S. agencies, the U.S. military, the CDC teams, the AID disaster response teams, the DART teams, U.S. Public Health Service for their response to Ebola and for building capacity within Liberia in partnership with the Liberian government under the Global Health Security Agenda, the Global Health Security Agenda that was spearheaded in the Obama administration. All very positive statements, all very affirmative. And then he went on to Geneva for the World Health Assembly and gave a speech, which was also very interesting in detailing the value of WHO, the World Health Organization, in terms of our shared health security requirements and the kinds of reforms that are going to be needed in order to strengthen and make WHO more effective. So I took those steps as very promising. They're out of sync with budget proposals, and so we've got to see what happens on the Hill. The last thing I'd say on that is keep in mind that there's a pretty widely shared consciousness that we're in an era of rising health security concerns. I mean, we've just come through Ebola, Zika, prior to that, the pandemic flus, SARS. You know, we started the explosion of U.S. support in global health was driven by the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the late 90s into the early naught decade. It was all framed as a security threat with a moral and ethical obligation attached to it, and those issues remain so fundamental. I don't think that we're arguing from ground zero on health security. The Trump administration has kept in place the secretariat within the White House created by the Obama team to manage health security. They've kept that intact. They've recruited Tim Ziemer to head it up, who was head of PMI, the President's Malaria Initiative, initially under President Bush, then under President Obama for 11 years. Did a terrific job, very widely respected person. Those are positive steps. Over to you, Tony.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is it's been interesting to follow the rhetoric among the congressional leadership. And Congressman Tom Cole from Oklahoma, who's chair of the Labor HHS Appropriations Committee on the House side, does not make a statement now about his support for NIH without also endorsing CDC and bringing up the potential pandemic threats that this administration will face, and actually told Secretary Price pretty bluntly to expect pandemic threats in the administration, and that the budget proposal would put the country at risk and also add political risk to the administration. So, and Senator Roy Blunt, whose his Congressman Cole's counterpart on the House side made the same point last week in a congressional hearing. So it does appear that the leaders in Congress do get it, and as such, I don't think they're going to approve these level of cuts. So I think the message is getting through up on the Hill.
And it's important also to emphasize that, as you mentioned about Little Fogarty with its $70 million budget, that the Fogarty International Center really girds and supports an array of global health investments and programs across the U.S. government, including PEPFAR, the President's Malaria Initiative, and others. So its reach is well beyond its own specific institution. On climate change, the Department of Defense has put out reports describing that climate change is a clear and present danger to the United States and the world. Can you share with us, is there any traction on supporting the outstanding work done by the Environmental Protection Agency and the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, others, on climate change, including the CDC? Does that security argument work at all in Congress? Is there any hope to maintain or increase investments in climate change work by the U.S.?
My own personal feeling, Tony's closer to this on the Hill. I mean, I think that climate change has just become such a dire situation, and the withdrawal, the vilification of EPA, the effort to gut EPA is very advanced. Less so on NOAA. NOAA's taking some hits on some very vital things. But the fact that EPA is just being targeted to be gutted is extreme. It's underway. It's taking it in, and it's attached to the assault on basic science. And it's even more viscerally felt, I think, in the center of the White House than some of the other issues we're talking about. Tony?
No, I totally agree. It's dismal. We've been trying to talk about environmental health as opposed to climate change, but it's all one and the same. I will say there is President Trump signed an executive order calling on all the federal agencies to submit reorganization plans, and those are due in the next month or two. We're likely to see proposals to cut FTEs from federal agencies, and we're expecting that those will be heavily centered on environmental health and climate change. At CDC, for example, the budget did not cut any FTEs, even though it's proposing to cut the budget by 21%. We're likely to see those FTE cuts and massive FTE cuts come in these reorganization plans. Some of which the administration can implement on their own without congressional approval. So I would say it's particularly dire. I agree.
Just remind people, you know, the OES Bureau, the Oceans Energy Sciences Bureau at State Department, took $1 billion hit in the FY18 budget on the Green Climate Fund. AID is getting out of the game. It's to Tony's point about the assault on these institutions, in terms of trying to get quickly set them back operationally and get out in front of Congress. That process is well underway on EPA, and it's well underway on State Department. There's roughly 20,000 career diplomats in the Foreign Service, and this year about 2,300 of those slots will disappear through attrition. But it's a willful and deliberate effort at shrinking the capacity of downgrading and then shrinking the capacity of the U.S. diplomatic corps. And the same thing at AID. AID is like, even though AID and state, the proposed operational budgets are 13 and 14% in cuts. But when you look at what is likely to happen in terms of human staffing, it's much more extreme than that.
And I would just add to that, there was a new GAO report out that shows that more than half of the federal workforce is eligible for retirement. And many are holding off, waiting to see if buyouts will be offered as part of this government reorganization plan. But we're likely to see a wholesale retirement wave as dedicated public servants won't sit around and participate in the destruction of many of the programs that they have dedicated their careers to. I would also add the budget, of course, devastates U.S. contributions to international organizations. And so while we're seeing dismantling of U.S. government infrastructure, the impact on international organizations is going to be severe as well.
And these cuts, as you both mentioned so eloquently, are really devastating the administrative capability of the United States to protect its own citizens, and indeed will have a profound impact upon global security. A question that we have here concerns identifying the best hard data about the repercussions of these cuts so our members can engage in more informed work to engage their elected officials. Do you know who's got the best hard data about the repercussions of these cuts?
I think it's it's an early moment. IHME, the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, when they put out back in the early part of the summer when they published their global health financing report, they had some companion pieces. One of them was a scenario for a 10% cut, and you can go look at that in terms of what the downstream consequences are. The work that Jen Cates and her team at Kaiser Family Foundation have just issued, which is a 6 or 7 page modeling paper. They worked with Avenir Health, and they looked at 3 scenarios, 3 different levels. They looked at the FY18 and then 2 more modest levels, and then they enumerated in terms of abortions committed, lives, infections in terms of HIV, TB, and the like. And those numbers are very, very useful and very much needed. We need to have people map out what the consequences are. I know at Elizabeth Glaser Foundation, Chip Lyons, been looking at this in terms of the sites, the populations that they serve in pediatric AIDS and others, and what the consequences would look like. Tony, what do you see out there in terms of new work?
The other thing I would point to is if one wants to turn it around and make it into a more positive case for the benefits of continued investment, the recent National Academy study on global health contains some excellent positive narrative language that can be reworded into support letters. So I think that new National Academy study is worth looking at for a more positive approach to the benefits of global health investments.
I agree. That study is written in a very clear, lucid way, and it's very balanced, very forward-looking, very positive. I agree entirely, Tony.
And we know that the public can move the political. And so a question from Ben is, how can our members best reach out to the public who may not already be on our side to be able to oppose the cuts that we're talking about and invest in the global health programs that we're trying to defend?
Well, I would just say, we need to, I think, as Dr. Morrison stressed, that we need to look at this as a long-term strategy of building support for global health investments and global health security. I mean, I would start at the community level. Let your family and friends and colleagues know of the importance of the work you're doing and that the federal investment played a key role. We're encouraging our members to do op-eds in their local newspapers because, frankly, politicians scan the op-ed pages looking for trends, making sure that local chambers of commerce know of the importance of these investments to your community. So I would build the case from the community up. winds will turn on Capitol Hill, and by building community and base support for our programs, in the long run, that will do us a great deal of good.
Thank you. And one of the things we're doing at CUGH is for those of you on the webinar, and please share this message with your colleagues, is we're attracting visual, short videos about the issues, opportunities, and work that you're doing in the field, and we are showcasing that publicly through our social media platform. So don't forget to use your social media platforms in this effort. So a question is about injury and the cuts to CDC, Tony, that you described. We know that injury is the leading cause of death and disability in young people, and in fact, when Americans go abroad, it's leading cause of death for young folks traveling abroad. Is that an argument that is getting any traction with congresspersons to reverse the devastating cuts to the Centers for Disease Control that Tony, you mentioned in your presentation?
Yeah, could I pause in answering that question and turn it over to Dr. Morrison, because I think he had something he wanted to add to that last question about advocacy at against the cuts.
Thanks, Tony. My point is that if you're talking, this is to Ben's question. I think it's important to remind people that there's a very mature coalition that has stood behind global health that includes universities, both researchers, faculty, students, the faith community, industry, implementers, foundations, NGOs, and many of the big major universities are themselves centers of excellence where they are doing a lot of training, they're engaged in R&D and discoveries, they have external partnerships, they're sources of innovation and employment. That's part of a global health kind of political economy that exists across our country, did not exist in that form 20 years ago. So I think you have a powerful argument to make in those settings, in pointing to all of these different actors that are part of this coalition that have stood by these programs and benefited from them and created these places across our country that are your membership, really, the CUGH core membership, are these places that have become centers of excellence. And I think that message needs to be brought across to elected leadership, that this is really an important sector for the community and for the vitality of the economy and for the place in the world that these people have. In terms of injuries, addressing injuries is something that we can do a hell of a lot better at. It's referenced in the Academy report that Tony mentioned. It's not expensive. It's really a question of putting a spotlight. It's a question of getting the right transport policies, best practices, regulatory environment. It is incredible, the data on the injuries and fatalities that are experienced in low and middle income countries. It's an area where much could be done with just some leadership and focus, and it doesn't carry a huge price tag.
Yeah, I would add, we're not hearing a lot about injuries up on the Hill, but there is an area, I think, of growing concern that we need to address, at least in our advocacy and education work. We held a briefing yesterday on the House side with 5 public health school deans from Appalachia talking about public health approaches to the opioid epidemic. And interestingly, a congressman from West Virginia attending the briefing made the case that while we are focused on it as a domestic issue in certain areas, that it is a global health concern and that Congress needs to pay more attention to the opioid epidemic as a global health issue. And I think you cannot go into a congressional office now without being asked about what your schools and programs are doing to address the opioid epidemic. I think we need to take advantage of that interest and concern to talk about it in terms of a global health issue and a global health epidemic as well.
May I just jump in on that, Keith? Tony's point is a really profound point. Much of the global health world has not linked in any explicit or systematic way to the opioid epidemic, which is become a colossal crisis in America, and it's no longer simply confined to an Appalachian and New England hot zones, although the situations in those areas are the most dire. It's become nationalized, and it's become internationalized with fentanyl from China, fentanyl and heroin in through Mexico. It's elevated as a priority on interdiction purposes in our bilateral relationship with the Chinese and the Mexicans, and it also has huge complications in the debates domestically about the reform of our health system. I mean, you look at what's happening right now and the trade-offs that are being negotiated out. So I do think that to the degree your constituency programs are beginning to get more engaged on this, it becomes easier to say that we're talking about both health security at home and abroad, and we're not ignoring this enormous crisis that's right in our midst.
And great points. Go ahead, Tony.
I would just add, our rhetoric on Fogarty and some of the other issues has moved toward communicable diseases because that's a easier sell. We kind of minimize the impact of these programs on non-communicable diseases, and we, in fact, altered our Fogarty sign-on letter to also stress the important work that Fogarty does on the non-communicable side as well.
And I think for the viewers to know, 50,000 Americans died last year from overdosing. And so part to the point of investing in non-communicable diseases that kill far more people than infectious diseases is what suggestions can you have for our membership to be able to convince the congresspersons to invest in all of the institutions we're talking about today, from NIH to CDC, EPA, NOAA, USAID, all have some play in non-communicable diseases. Is there any argument that you can give to our members to be able to attract attention to this issue to congresspersons?
I don't know if Steve has any suggestions. Again, we're trying to link data to narratives, and it's easier sell to talk about epidemics in terms of well-known vectors. People don't necessarily think of the opioid crisis, for example, as following a traditional epidemic curve pattern, but it does. It's a 37-year pattern of epidemic. So, trying to bring that to people's attention, that there are, in fact, lessons to be learned from previous efforts, and there are lessons to be learned from the global community that will impact the treatment and public health initiatives in rural America, that we have so much to learn from our global partners that will affect policy in the United States. We need to get over the hubris that we know it all.
And we're just down to the last few minutes. I just wanted to give each of you a minute to close. If you had any closing comments, you've done a fabulous job, Steve and Tony, and we're really grateful. Steve, I'll go to you first since Tony started. Did you have a minute wrap up of any key points you want to make? And then Tony, it will be over to you.
Well, thank you again for organizing this, Keith, and to you and Karen and your other staff members. This is very valuable service you provide. I think just to remind your membership that what they do is really important. This is a period, unprecedented period of challenge in which it's very important to mobilize and become politically active. And many, many, many people who have not had a history of being active are suddenly becoming very active. That's one of the great benefits of this crisis that we're in right now, is that we're seeing people take to action in new and very important ways, and people should see that as terribly valuable. One closing point on the opioid epidemic. We do face grave gaps in our ability to deal with OxyContin overprescription, in providing effective prevention and treatment. There are enormous gaps in law enforcement. We have not turned the corner at all on this runaway epidemic, And as you point out, last year now, 2016, 59,000 overdose fatalities. It's an extraordinary number, and it's still on an upward trajectory. I do think that there are some very encouraging signs in this administration. I think Scott Gottlieb at FDA has arrived and taken this opioid epidemic up in earnest and is moving ahead very rapidly and should be commended for that. And others, I mean, I expect we'll see lots of action by CDC, and we'll see lots of action, further action by DEA and others in this period. There's a lot of turmoil, a lot of ferment, and within Congress, as I think Tony was suggesting, there's an incredibly active bipartisan caucus in both chambers on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. Dr. Stephen Morrison, Vice President at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thank you very much, Steve. Tony, over to you.
Yeah, I don't really have much more to add, and I want to thank Dr. Martin and Dr. Morrison for this opportunity. I would just reemphasize that there's nothing inevitable about the outcome on these issues, and that they are highly dependent on our remaining engaged. There is a concern about advocacy fatigue when it appears as every issue that we care about passionately is in play, but we need to stick with it for the long run, make a positive case for the programs that we believe are really making a difference both locally and globally, and continue to make that message repeatedly at every possible opportunity. I think it also inspires us to continue to do the great work in the public and global health field that many of our members are doing. They should be inspired to do even more with the resources they have, make sure that their work remains to be of the highest caliber and quality, and to make sure that it is not done in a vacuum. Spread the word about your results and the scalability of your work to make an even greater difference both locally and globally. So thank you again.
Thank you very much, Tony. Mr. Tony Mazzaschi, who's the Senior Director for Research and Policy at the Association of Schools and Programs of Public Health. I'd like to thank Karen Lamb and our office here for her hard work putting this on. And to all of our viewers, this webinar will be on our website at cugh.org. And a closing thought. We know that the public moves the political. So please engage the public about what you heard today. Please engage your congresspersons. Our public servants who do an extraordinary job cannot defend their institutions because they are public servants. So that role falls on us. And we who know the impact of these cuts, we who know that these cuts are going to make this country and this world less safe, less prosperous, we have an obligation to exercise our duty, to use our knowledge, and to be able to inform elected officials about what these cuts will do to make this country and this world a stronger, safer, healthier, and more prosperous place. So thank you very much for attending this webinar, and we look forward to staying in touch with you in the future. Thanks very much.
Thank you.